Back when the world was young, Clinton was a graduate student of mine. And we were both invited to a meeting in coastal Brazil. And I don't remember a lot about that meeting. I know there were huge quantities of caipirinhas being served. And the people there were trying to produce a map of where the conservation priorities should be in coastal Brazil. And they did, and it was a complete piece of garbage when they produced it. But Clinton had produced a very compelling mosaic of several satellite images. And it was, I don't know, 2 meters wide by, a meter tall or something like that. And we had it up there. And it was clear that just looking at the satellite images, we could come up with a much better idea of where we wanted to work. And one of those places was next to a reserve, the biological reserve União, Reserva União. And it was isolated from the rest of the forest by a cattle pasture. And Clinton and I both realized that, one of the simplest things we could do to effect conservation in Brazil was to buy the cattle pasture and plant it with trees to create a biological corridor. And we asked how much that cattle pasture would cost, and the answer was $300,000. And that was about the cost of this conference. We thought, rather than sitting around drinking caipirinhas, we could have bought that land and planted it with trees and we'd be doing more good. So we decided we were going to create an organization and fundraise to buy this piece of property for our Brazilian friends. So the first year I raised $300 and felt absolutely stupid. I thought at this rate, it's going to take me 1,000 years. And the next year, I went back with a couple of wonderful donors, and they wrote a check for $300,000. And that's how Saving Nature got started. Clint and I realized that if we were smart, if we had good maps, if we used our science, we could do conservation very effectively. We could make a huge amount of difference. And so we've been doing that ever since. And Clinton is absolutely the world's best conservation cartographer. Nobody produces conservation maps like Clinton. He is an absolute treasure. The map we produced of where we needed to work in Brazil came out in an article in Scientific American, and it's been published in all sorts of books that have examples of maps. So without further ado, Professor Clinton Jenkins.
All right, thank you, Stuart. Yeah, that's a good summary of how it got started. I still use the picture of that cattle pasture I took before I think digital cameras. I think I had to scan a film picture of it. Um, and it was nice to realize, years later that got transformed in a forest corridor. You go there now and you drive through the under the
Through the
canopy of
forest.
the
Yeah.
forest. Um, And so that was a really clear message to me that you could make a big difference in conservation in a relatively small area, and for not very much money, actually. I mean, at that time, it seemed like a lot of money, maybe because I was a graduate student, I didn't have any money. But later I realized, there's a lot of money in the world. I could fund those sort of things. So that sort of drove the passion forward to figure out where all these special places are in the world. And yeah,
And you spent well, first of all, this is a big day for you. I understood you got a new apartment in Brazil.
yeah, we just we just bought an apartment
Well, congratulations on
hour and
that.
a half ago.
An hour and a half ago. Okay, that
Yeah,
that was very recent. Okay, well, thanks for joining us. Then right after that, thanks for getting that done before. You spent years turning satellite imagery and species data into actionable conservation, as Stuart discussed. Could you walk us through what species mapping is, and when did you realize that maps could do more than describe the world, that they could actually change what gets saved?
Sure. Um, so when I got started in graduate school, and I went and talked to a lot of potential advisors. Stuart was one of them. I drove down to Knoxville and we talked over some of the ideas. One of the ideas was actually was not in Brazil. The first one was in the Everglades with endangered bird in the Everglades, Cape Sable seaside sparrow. And there was already a research program going on there to understand the ecology of this sparrow. Um, but one of the questions to be answered was basically where are all of them? Where is their habitat? How does it change over time? Um, and that was sort of the first place I really got into like GIS and mapping and remote sensing and satellite imagery and stuff and understanding how it works. Because at that time, nobody really did that, not in any seriously technical way, because the software and the equipment was too expensive and ecologists didn't do that sort of stuff. Um, and like I think I remember the computer to run this stuff was like $20,000 or something back then. It was ridiculously expensive, and no ecologist would spend that much money on a computer. But somehow I remember Stuart convinced somebody to buy it for the lab. Um, and so from that, I learned all about satellite imagery and how to look at it and put species locations on a map, and you could see the habitat and see how it changes, and you see how lost habitat could be lost. Um, but at that time, the place I really wanted to work then was in Brazil, and that was one of the other part of my PhD. The question was kind of where are the really important places for bird
Mhm.
conservation in Brazil? We had a rough idea from some previous work. It would be the Atlantic forest around the southeast, around Rio de Janeiro state. But the challenge was that, I mean, Rio de Janeiro state is great. If you've been to Rio, it's a magnificent city, but it's huge. I mean, it's about the size of North Carolina in terms of size. It's got several mountain ranges, 20 million people or so. You're like, well, you got to get something a little more detailed if you're going to actually make a decision on the ground.
Right.
And that's where we like started looking at satellite imagery and say, well, where's the forest, right? Is there any decent forest map? So I went poking around and I found a forest map. Still didn't know that much about this stuff and what could go wrong. So I got a forest map and we made some little simple models of endangered bird habitat. Great. And I still remember I went and we presented it. I think it was in St. Louis. Um, the only thing I really remember was there was a Brazilian lady there who looked at it and she's like, yeah, that map's completely wrong. And she just went to point out and was like, okay, this part, that's not forest. This part, this is all deforested here. This is wrong. And she's like, your idea was pretty good here, the concept, but the map you're putting into it was crap. And I didn't make the forest map. It was one that already existed. Um, but that was a very harsh lesson. Like, don't trust, your map, blindly. Make sure it's actually accurate. And if it's not, you got to go make your own. And so that's what I did. I had to go make my own forest map and use it because there wasn't one out there that existed. So went from there, just like, okay, we can identify where the forest is, where individual species might be more or less, and start narrowing it down to places that would be higher priorities, which O'Neill Biological Reserve turned out to be the top one at that time. Um, so from that experience, I believe that conference was in the city of Atibaia that we went.
Hmm.
Conference. There was a lot of things that there was a lot of fun times at those sort of workshops, conferences. They were well funded and people enjoyed them. That's what got people to go. But the
And
result,
lots of free caipirinhas.
lots of free caipirinhas. Yeah,
And
yeah, they're nice.
the maps showed that. The maps were really fuzzy looking maps, you know?
Yeah, they were just big blobs on a map. I mean, some of them would be the
Which is what
size
you
of,
felt like after two caipirinhas.
yeah, they were just like somebody just, I'm not joking. Somebody just took a marker and just like, this place is important.
What drink is that? Cap? I never heard of that. What is that?
It's uh it's basically rum with sugar. It's a
Okay.
blind.
Oh, that's why they're fuzzy.
Yeah, it's delicious. They're delicious. They're easy to drink. They're well made. But yeah, they're kind of dangerous because you could have two or three of them and then it's all over. Um,
And then
but
what? Sorry, continue, please.
it's kind of come back around to this, that workshop where that was the first round, what they call it area priority areas exercise. This was linked to the Brazilian government. Um, Many years later, I was living in the city next to that because I lived in Brazil for many years. I was living next to that city. I passed by the place where that workshop happened like every week. And I went on to lead the process to update those priority areas for the country, bringing together people and better data and trying to make better maps and better decisions. So it came full circle.
Les Kaufman says real biologists can do four before functional compromise.
Yeah.
Let me tell you a story. For many many years, Julie and I had a condo in the Florida Keys, um, and the priest at the Episcopal church that we went to, a wonderful man called Father Ron Johnson, he came over to our house one night and we made him a caipirinha. And he said, "This is really good." So we made him a second one. Um, and then, the next time we were in church after the sermon, his wife came up to us and said, "Whatever you do, don't give Father Ron any more than two caipirinhas."
Okay, this is a dangerous drink. I'm learning.
Yeah.
Um, and what made you realize that they could actually change what gets saved? That you maps have the power to really change and affect things.
Because we showed them to people and the people understood them.
Hmm.
But you can tell people, places are super important and they'll see some, cute animal pictures and stuff, but they don't really grasp usually exactly where places are. But if you show somebody a map and the landscape where things are and give them some reference, they can navigate and they can see what the problems are. They can see if things are fragmented and say, oh, the species got to move from here to there and there's cattle pasture and they won't move. It makes sense to people. Um, it's easier nowadays because you can do like Google Earth, and people are used to having like these views of the whole world now that you can just fly in digitally and get a good idea of the landscape. In the past, it was much more difficult. Um, but the map makes it really easy to tell the story and guide people through the process of how you get from, you know, somebody that says, "Hey, I want to protect birds or ants or whatever." And you say, well, okay, here's the world, here's the diversity of all those things. Here's the ones that we really worry about, because there's some, you don't want to just look at all species, because some are more likely to go extinct than others. Some things are really common, right? We don't worry about, Norway rats going extinct because they're everywhere, right? Or cockroaches. So you look at just the things that, hey, these are the things we're worried about, and here's where they concentrate, and you can just guide people down to all the places in the world and say, here's where they're at, and here what the issue is in the places that need protection or not. And if they're willing, take them there and show them. If they're already there, the people, support them to do what a lot of times what people already want to do. They know what the issues are. In that site in Rio de Janeiro, there were people working the Golden Line tamarin already. Um, and there was knowledge of what the big issues were, the fragmentation in areas that were important for tamarins. They coincided with places really important for birds, but it wasn't super novel to the people right there locally, right? They knew the place where they were at was super important already. It's more getting other people to recognize that and then supporting doing something good there. Um, And so with that, for me, I was pretty good at it. I like computers and technical stuff, always have. It's like I can do this. Um, it kind of surprises me even to this day how little of it's done or how
Mhm.
little of it's done well, how few people are involved in doing it over the whole world. Um, I can remember um, I have this website that some people may have seen, a biodiversitymapping.org website that has a lot of the maps I've made, a lot of the papers I was involved in. Um, and yeah, that website got started because I was sitting in a library in Franklin, North Carolina, visiting my brother, who happened to be living there at the time. And he was doing something there. I was basically bored, and it's like I'm just checking my email, checking Facebook or something at the time. And somebody came up with a question to me, and they're like, "Hey, where's like the peak of diversity of salamanders?" And I was like, "I don't know, it's somewhere around here, right?" Salamanders are really diverse in the southern Appalachians. Salamanders don't occur everywhere in the world. I was like, "Yeah, I grew up finding all kinds of salamanders." Like, well, I did some searching. Like, well, there was no decent map out there of where all the salamanders were. There were maps of individual salamanders. So I thought about it and I was sitting there, I was like, I can make that map. So I connected, I could remotely connect to my computer. I think that was a Duke at the time that had the data. And I was like, so I made one right then in the span of like an hour or two. I was like, I can do this, it's not hard. And I posted it. And somewhere in the bowels of Facebook back there is the first map. And it got huge interactions. Like, wow, this map's way more detailed and better and easier to understand than the other maps. And I was like, yeah, I don't know why nobody had done this. And from that, I started making for lots of other groups of things, and it just went from there. Um,
Just seems like a good map in conservation is like a good business plan for a startup where, the better the map, the more detailed, from what I'm hearing from you, the more likely people that aren't actually living there will believe in the project. And that's why I feel like your maps have been so helpful for saving nature and helping us get funding. And
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Julia doesn't have a quantitative bone in her body. And when she listens to my seminars early on, she said she'd had, I have too many graphs, I have too many charts. So I started taking charts and graphs and things out until the point where I didn't have any at all. And she was happy with that. But she's really happy with maps. Maps are really intuitive.
Hmm.
People understand when we show that map of Brazil and we showed that isolated reserve that was a forest island. And Clinton and I knew immediately we need to get the land to connect it. But the thing about Clinton's maps, you were talking about it being a good business plan. It's a bad business plan because Clinton gives those maps out for free. Anybody could go to his conservation mapping site and get the
That's
map.
true.
And from time to time we see big conservation groups who shall be nameless, and they'll have these fantastic maps and they'll say, aren't we doing wonderful things? And we've got these glorious maps. And you need a magnifying glass to, if you're lucky, to read in the bottom right-hand corner where the map comes from. And those are Clinton's maps. So yeah, uh, a lot of people steal his maps.
Yeah, there are. I don't get too worried about it, but I have occasionally. I have actually sat in seminars before and seen my own maps show up without my name on them. And I didn't call out the people that have done that. It's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of rewarding to know that people are using them. They want them to be out there, and but sometimes, yeah, they wander off and they lose the attribution of what the original source is. I mostly want people to just know where they came from so they can make suggestions or hopefully make a better one later. Um, but yeah, as far as a business plan, I don't get almost none of the stuff on making the maps of biodiversity. Most of it's never been funded specifically. It's just sort of been projects that happened.
it's just so we're so lucky to be able to work with you in order to get these accurate maps. It must be like hearing your song on the radio for the first time when you see someone else's presentation have your own map, you know? Like,
Yeah, it's
oh,
great.
it's like what?
They're in the textbook. They're actually in the conservation biology textbooks now.
That's amazing. And I know Stuart shared this really interesting project you recently worked on, researching the Amazonian fresh waters. Um, and much of your career has been focused on mapping biodiversity in forests. What made you turn your attention to Amazonian freshwaters, and why do you think they've been overlooked for so long?
Well, the Amazon stuff got started not originally with fresh waters. It was with a colleague of ours named Matt Feiner, and some other folks that were working on issues in the Western Amazon. It was more at first like the Western Amazon as a region was like more ignored um, part of the Amazon. Everybody was knew about deforestation in the Amazon that was happening in Brazil.
Hmm.
That was along the arc of deforestation, basically southeastern Amazon. But there are all these other threats going on, and a lot of them in the Western Amazon. A big part of it was oil development. Most people, even today, don't think about oil in the Amazon, but there's actually huge reserves of oil in the Amazon. And the development of them is quite messy. And there are other threats in the Western region. And so I got involved in that, just also like how to map these out, working with a colleague who had no idea how to deal with data, but was good at finding the data, but didn't know how to open it.
Hmm.
Wasn't, shy about that. It's like, look, sometimes they show up like, I got all this stuff, well, last month, what's in here? And I'm like, okay, I'll give me a week. I'll figure out, I'll dig through this and figure what's in there. And we produced several papers together on that and just mapping out the threats to different regions in the Amazon. Um, that developed into other collaborations, specifically on like dams, because dams are a big concern for the Amazon because they'll fragment the freshwater systems.
Right.
And most of the Amazon doesn't have dams yet, but there's hundreds proposed. They're still building some. I don't know how many will get built in the end. But people were overlooking it. They just weren't thinking about it because it's a remote part of the world. Um, so I started that, trying to bring attention to that. It's like, hey, these are big threats. This is a globally important area. It has effects throughout South America. It's a fifth of the world's fresh water. A huge part of the Amazon is actually wetlands. It's not forest. You hear the Amazon, and most people think, big giant trees, green sea there of trees. And there are big parts of the Amazon are like that, but 20 or 30% of it, like in this map that's up there now that I put together, is wetlands. They're flooded forests sometimes or other sort of freshwater ecosystems that, they're not just like a big green forest that you could go walking through. You got to get through it in a canoe or some other boat. Um, and so that got brought in to other people who are interested in freshwater issues. Now I'm here at FIU, Florida International University, colleagues working in the tri-border region of Colombia, Peru, and Brazil, looking at freshwater ecosystems and how people interact and sort of manage life in those sort of ecosystems. Because a lot of people live in the Amazon. We did an estimate, it's like 40 or 50 million people live in the Amazon, right? And they're not just a bunch of indigenous people running around in villages like, some people will imagine still. It's like, no, no, they're big cities in the Amazon. Everybody's got internet because they got Starlink. Um, but it's a very different sort of lifestyle. Because it very much depends on the freshwater systems being healthy. And there's a crazy number of species there that people don't even know what they are yet. They've not been described. There's all these endemic fish that, they're just there. Nobody's studied them much. People locally know about them, but that knowledge doesn't get out beyond that very much. And so, yeah, I kept going to the Amazon and working with people, stirring up some trouble occasionally. We managed to stop several years ago a big oil palm development that made some news. That was a bit tense. Um, Oil palm developers are not always the most law-abiding groups in the world, um, but managed to stop the expansion of one area that was deforesting, thousands and thousands of hectares of Amazon forest for oil palm. Um, so yeah. And I keep working on that. We had a meeting today of people working in the same area that are interested in environmental health issues related to contamination of the water from like mercury and stuff like that. So it may go in that direction. Who knows? Yeah.
Yeah, we got Les says that I'm not going to pronounce this right. I'm sorry. Xingu fishes will be gone before we know them.
Um, yeah, there is that. So yeah, when some of the dams go up, and they break down migrations of fish, where they isolate some areas and totally change the dynamics. There's probably things going to disappear before we even document them. I mean, that's the same in other areas, the terrestrial places too. Like most of the species that are going to disappear or close to disappearing, we don't actually know they're there because, I mean, how many people study snails, right? Or fungi?
I, I used to think everything was studied. That when I was a kid, I thought everything, because I read these books with all these animals, and I thought every animal had hundreds and thousands of people researching it,
Yeah.
and it's
Oh,
not that way. So we're
it's
losing
not at all.
so
You know,
many unique ones every
what
time.
I can remember when I actually saw these little cards the last time I was home visiting my parents. They bought from me and my brother these cards. I don't remember who produced them, but it was just a collection of little cards, and they would have animals and plants and things on them. And we had hundreds of them. You would get little packs of them, and they were like, "Oh, this one's critically endangered, or this one's in the Amazon. This one lives in Borneo." And we didn't get all of them. I don't even know how many of them there were. They just gave them to us, and I didn't think about it, but that probably influenced me of thinking like, "Hey, here's all these cool things that people are studying." And now I realize, like, wow, those are not representative at all of what most species are, because they were all like charismatic things, birds and mammals and things, big showy
Mhm.
things, or colorful frogs. Um, but yeah, most species are little things, insects and or plants. There's like 400,000 kinds of plants in the world, right? And most of them are you wouldn't recognize. Um, so I mean, but we make decisions on the things we know something about because you can't really make a decision based on something you don't know is there or not. So we do our best, and as we learn more things, we try and adjust our decision making.
O
Um,
I mean,
Obi
one of my favorite books, I'm sure it's Clinton's too, was published by a former colleague of mine when I was at the University of Tennessee, and it's The Fishers of Tennessee, written by David Etnoyer. And it shows this incredible number of unique fishes, particularly darters, that live in the rivers that come down off the Appalachians. And I'm not a fish expert, and I'm never going to be a fish expert. Um, but I just love flicking through the pages of this. And these darters, are no more than, a couple of inches long, but they're gorgeously colored. One of them, of course, was a fish that David discovered called the snail darter, which became important. But when you have those kind of picture books, you begin to realize what an incredibly biologically rich part of the world we live in when we're in, Tennessee and North Carolina. And of course, Clinton has some spectacular maps of fish diversity too. So, these wonderful picture books um, and Clinton's maps together, and you realize that there are, conservation issues that we have to deal with here. We're very proud at Saving Nature is that we made our first grant to work in the Appalachians this year. We got a major grant for um, protecting an area of biodiversity just north of here, and so yeah, we need to appreciate this. We need to appreciate the little things and just how biologically wonderful they are.
and
yeah.
Les just said regarding that, Stuart, there's yet hope for you if you can love darters. And
That that has to be from Les Kaufman. That's the kind of comment he would make.
yep. And Ovi asked you, Clinton, the mercury contamination of river water, is that issue spread across the entire basin or
Um,
specific to a few areas?
yeah, I'm not an expert on it. That just came up today. I can tell you what little I know about it. So there's a big concern because of the gold mining going on in parts of the Amazon, much of it illegal and much of it done very messily. It's done, by garimpos or garimpeiros, where they'll go and they'll just rip up a river and they'll sift out the gold pieces and use mercury to the the gold sticks to the mercury essentially, but then you have to boil off the mercury to get rid of it so that you're just left with the gold. But of course, that mercury goes somewhere. It'll go up in the air and eventually rain back down and it contaminates the landscape and the rivers. There's also, from what people have told me, though, a relatively high natural amount of mercury in some parts of the Amazon. Not the level that the gold mining is going to cause, but um, it's an issue, and a lot of the fish have some fairly high levels of mercury in them. But I don't think that many people study it. One of the things we might look at in the future with some colleagues is like, hey, do people avoid the right fish, right? Because some fish don't get eaten by indigenous groups or people, riverine people have been there for generations. There's just some fish they just don't eat. And I'd be curious to know, like, well, do they kind of know that that's not a healthy fish to eat because it accumulates toxins just naturally? But I don't know. Um,
Well, that's a good question. It's interesting to hear kind of just your knowledge in relation to river waters. And I had a question you real quick about the difference between we try to connect fragmented forest and saving nature, but one thing that I thought would be interesting to talk about is your relationship between connecting a river and the
sure.
difference between those two things.
So it's in a place like the Amazon, it's really interesting. It's really fairly complex too, because you could, like, if you think of a typical river in most people's mind, right? The water flows downhill, right? It goes out and eventually goes into the ocean. And so you have this sort of longitudinal connectivity, right? You can imagine a fish going up and down the river as long as there's not a dam or a waterfall or something that prevents it from going up. It's kind of like salmon migrations, right? We see salmon migrations all the time in the nature documentaries. Um, but in a place like the Amazon, and some other areas that have these sort of meandering flat, or these rivers that meander through flat areas, in the flooding season, the water will spread out sometimes, tens or even hundreds of kilometers. Um, and through the forest. And so for part of the year, the aquatic life and a lot of the fish, they will spread out laterally from the rivers. And they're feeding out there and sometimes spawning. And then in the drier season, it'll sort of contract back. So you have fish that go up and down the river, but there's all this movement out from the edges of the rivers too into the forest or other ecosystems. And it's so extensive that I mean, there are a lot of tree species that, like their fruits, you know, they're dispersed by fish, not by like birds or monkeys or something like that. They actually produce their fruit and it'll be underwater and a fish will come and eat the fruit, just like you can imagine a bird comes and picks a fruit off of a tree or something, except it's going in the water because that's how the system works. Um, and there's really not great understanding of how the dynamics of that function or how we measure it because there's no index really even to say, hey, how fragmented is. Yeah. I put together a proposal once to try and figure out, I was like, hey, can we figure out some way to sort of quantify this so we can get a handle on how bad the situation is, what the impact would be if you put a dam in, but I didn't get anywhere with it. Nobody was willing to give me $1 million yet to go figure that out.
Maybe someone listening will. I feel like everyone on this call is just as interested in this kind of stuff as you and I are.
I got people lined up would love to spend time to figure that out and say, hey, how do we get a handle on this? Because like all these on this map you're showing here, I put this together. This is like sort of a Frankenstein map actually. It's
Uh-huh.
very simplified here, but this is put together a whole bunch of different data sets because there was no map of Amazon wetlands out there, like all of the Amazon. Um, all those blue areas like the Pacaya Samiria and the Llanos de
Mhm.
Mojos, the big blue areas. I mean, those are huge areas that flood part of the year. Um, and it's most people have never heard of them, but they're super important.
Yeah, and just from hearing about all these species that just are out there that people just don't know about that could be amazing. I'm sure there's so many in these areas that are super biodiverse areas, I'm sure with uh interesting. Oh, by the way, Obi says, I assume the Amazon has the largest diversity of
Yeah.
freshwater fish. What are the major present threats to this diversity?
Um, it does have the highest diversity of fish. Actually, there's specialists on it. They're studying it at the University of Tennessee now. As a friend of mine, Guido, is finishing his PhD there. So there's like freshwater fish of the Amazon and their migrations. The big threats are dams because they can interrupt their movement patterns. Um, Mining, probably, oil contamination of fresh waters. Um, Deforestation in general, but that's sort of a generalized threat of all parts of the Amazon. But specific for the fish, I would guess that. There's some overfishing too. If you get near big cities, you'll get overfished. At least the big things that are worth eating, they get fished out. Um, so yeah, but the big diversity is sort of in those rivers going up into the Andes and stuff. You get huge diversification, and there's like new species discovered every year, or I should say documented, right? Some of them are known, but they're not documented in the scientific literature yet.
I
That's
think I think the important thing about what Clinton's doing and why it's so central to our mission at saving nature is with all of these things, we need good maps. We need to know where to act and how to act. And so much of that is driven by having the maps to guide it. I mean, many people think of the Amazon as being some sort of homogeneous forest, and it's not
Not,
homogeneous. It's a very complex area, and having those maps can shape what we do. Some of the early work that Clinton mentioned a few minutes ago in Ecuador with Matt Feiner um, was incredibly important in stopping oil companies going into areas, nominally run by indigenous people like the Warani. And they're saying, look, these are important areas for biodiversity. The oil companies are not supposed to go there. And look, here's a satellite image that shows that they are going there. So this stuff is not just intellectually interesting, but it supports our saving nature mission
yeah.
to to have practical outcomes.
Yeah, you can see people's misbehaving, right? If you know what the rules are and where they can go, where they're not supposed to go, you can see it. And you can quickly provide the evidence. So, look, somebody violated the agreement. Somebody's running an illegal road into a place. Um, yeah.
And one thing I feel like Obi already kind of transitioned me to the previous question, which was about threats. So that was kind of addressed. So I wanted to talk about area of habitat. You've helped advance the area of habitat approach by the IUCN. In plain language, what does AOH change when we prioritize protection? And what's one example where it flipped the script?
Okay. Yeah, this is a big change in sort of how species get mapped. If you think of like how most maps for species were before, or still are, a lot of them, it's basically, a blob on a map. If you get like a field guide, like a Peterson field guide or, Sibley field guide for birds or something, it's going to have a map of some part of the world and then like a colored blob and say this species is found in this area some part of the year, right? And it'll be a huge polygon. Um, but we've always known that, well, really that species doesn't occur in all that area because you pick an area and like, look, it's not all the same, right? If you got a mountain there, some species are at the bottom of the mountain, some in the middle, some at the top. It changes. Some of the polygon is not habitat for that specific species. Um, but we didn't have the capacity to really show that in a systematic way. The concept for area of habitat is that, hey, we can do this now. We know generally where the species is, some sort of outer boundary. How much of the stuff within that polygon is likely to actually be habitat for that species? Um, One, it's got to be some sort of natural vegetation that it can live in. I mean, some areas you go and like, well, it's 90% deforested, so only 10% of that area is really likely to have a chance of having that species anymore. So you narrow your focus 90% right there. He's like, look, it's not this blob, it's only these pieces because there's nothing left in the others. So don't worry about them right now. This small subset is where you need to focus. And others are just, maybe it's a species that needs to live near a river. Well, it's only going to the places near the river then that are actually habitat. It's not going to be the big blob that includes all the rivers. You can say, no, it's just these little lines, these little strips going through here that are actually habitat for that species. So the map needs to reflect that. Now, it takes time to produce them, but they're getting better at it. There's some automated ways now that people are trying to, you know, do it. I did some early on. The stuff in Rio was a form of that area of habitat maps. We didn't have that term back then. But like the first one was for a species called gray-winged cotinga, which is endemic to Rio de Janeiro. It's the only place in the world that occurs. Um, and it occurs in high up in the mountains, above like 1,400 meters. For people who don't do meters, that's about 4,500 feet.
Thank you.
I didn't do meters either. I grew up in East Tennessee. I didn't know what the metric system was, until I went to college. Somebody probably mentioned it to me, but nobody cared. So then I had to learn it and realize that most of the world does kilometers and meters and stuff. Um, so that map was, at first there was only like 2 points, so that's not a very good map. Then later people say, oh, well, you can do a polygon. It's in this mountain range. It's like, yeah, but it's not all the mountain range because a lot of mountain range doesn't have forest or it's the wrong elevation. So if you just take that and say, give me all the areas above that elevation that have some green stuff on them, well, that's a better estimate of how much habitat there is for that bird than the other map. And so you quickly narrow down your potential targets for conservation. And it brings things into a much sharper focus. Um,
I have
we
to
don't
say, in
want to
that
waste our
particular
time on
example,
places that don't have anything, they don't have anything left, right? We got other things to worry about.
when
Still,
Clinton did that map, the obvious thing was we needed to go and explore some of the mountaintops
yeah.
where that
The
species
little blue
occurred.
dots, the little
Um,
blue patches on tops of all the
so,
mountains.
so we looked at the biggest blue patch, and with our long-term Brazilian partner Maria Alice Alves, she and I went up there by helicopter looking for this bird, and we got dropped off. And the idea is we were going to look for it for 3 days, and the helicopter was going to come back and rescue us, and the helicopter never came back. And we wouldn't have gone there if we could have got there any other way than by helicopter. And you can read the story about how we survived, how we drank the last tea bag from Fortnum Masons, of course, and how we managed to extricate ourselves from a mountaintop. So please go to our website and read that. Anyway, sorry, Clinton, I interrupted you.
I think I'm going to see Maria Lisi next week, by the way. The
Good.
ornithological conference and it's going to be in Espírito Santo. Um, so yeah, those sorts of maps are really can help point you to the places that are where you need to work. And we hope to eventually get those for all the major groups of like at least vertebrates, things that we know enough about that we could do it. Um, and yeah, that helps focus our attention much better.
Yeah, I mean, we couldn't do what we do at Saving Nature were it not for these fantastic maps that Clinton produces. They are absolutely vital. Look, we've got what, 10 minutes left. Andy, I'm interrupting your host duties. Are we ready for questions from the floor?
We already got some, Stuart, and
Oh, good.
and let's start with Obi asking, is AI or can AI help or play a role in mapping and species identification, distribution, etc.? And are
Um,
there significant ways it can muddy the waters?
That's interesting. AI is a funny thing because AI is this term that gets thrown around all the time, but it's many of the techniques that now get called AI have been around a while, sort of machine learning algorithms. Um, it's it's very good now for species identifications. Right? There's a lot of things like built into iNaturalist and eBird and Merlin and some of these softwares that can identify species by their call automatically or from a photo. Um, for actually modeling, where the habitat of a species is, um, probably not. And that's because you need too much data to drive sort of a complex AI model. Um, and it's almost overkill for the question. We can do a really good job with a very simple amount of information, right? If it's a species that needs forest, well, first just where's the forest, right? Make some maps. Now AI might come in and making a better map of the forest, the land cover map. Um, but in the actual modeling of the species, probably not. But we'll see. And a lot of people working on it. Um, we'll see where it goes.
And Edison says, Buenos noches, soy de Ecuador. So,
Ah, good to see you. I have a student in my environmental science class from Ecuador. I had a nice
wow.
conversation the other day.
Yeah, welcome. And here's a kind of more advanced question. So I might need some explanation from your end on what it means, from Les Kaufman. Have you found that increased resolution and spectral data richness of Sentinel has greatly enhanced map utility for conservation? So I don't know what any of that means in all transparency, but Les
Oh,
asked it, so we have to ask you.
okay. I don't specifically know. I understand his question. I think that the Sentinel satellites have become really valuable for monitoring and developing new land cover maps. I haven't done a land cover map in quite a while, and part of that is because a lot of groups are now producing much better ones.
Uh-huh.
So it's not necessary to kind of make custom ones. Especially for like Brazil and the Amazon, there's a group called Map Biomas, and they've been developing these big algorithms that can map every year, update every year, where the forest is in every different ecosystem. And I know they use Sentinel now. And it gets better every year because they rerun it, they get better algorithms, they get better data. So it's getting more detailed over time. And yeah, they have the resources to really do that. What really changed the situation there is not just the satellite, it's the open access to the imagery. Because if you have to buy the imagery, like 99% of the people are going to stop using it because they can't afford to buy imagery. They're just not going to play around with it. The ability to have a bunch of free imagery, and everybody's got computers now that can process an image, hugely expand the number of people trying things and developing new products, and everything got better just because it was easier to do, right? You got stuff, you got data to play around with. You can try out all kinds of new ideas.
Well, feel free to drop more questions in the chat, but in the meantime, I thought I'd ask you one before we have to head out. Just looking ahead, how can tools like biodiversity mapping and science-based policy shift the way we protect Amazonian freshwaters as well as the rest of the world? And what gives you hope that we can succeed?
Well, I think in terms of the mapping, I think we've got good directions going forward. The maps are getting a lot better. People are contributing lots of information. It's accessible. I think a lot of progress is being made. Um, it does get incorporated into decision making. I know it's kind of frustrating to see, policymakers, don't always listen to the science. That has its ups and downs in all countries. Um, and when I went through like the area priority areas process for Brazil, right? This is an official government Ministry of the Environment process. Um, they were very interested in having good data go into the decision-making process, but it had to be public data. It had to be accessible. They couldn't use data that people couldn't have access to because then nobody will trust the decisions.
Hmm.
one of the challenges at that time, this was several years ago, is like we had to use still like just crude range maps. We didn't have like area of habitat maps. This is for the whole Atlantic forest, and it had to be for the whole Atlantic forest. We didn't have the data to feed into the algorithms to to inform that process, even though they wanted them. I wanted them, but it's like, hey, we don't have them, and unless you can produce them and publish them, we can't. You can't use them. If that process were to happen again, they're supposed to do it every 5 years, but realistically, it happens about every 10 years. So maybe here in another few years. We could do that for a lot of different groups of organisms. We could say, okay, now we're not just like big polygons or like where this, we could say, this fragment has it or not. And that could produce much more informed sort of priorities. And that affects the policies that happen in those places. It informs where new protected areas get created. And a bunch of countries do that. Um, Not so much in the US, I guess. I don't know what the status is. I often don't understand conservation decision making in the US, how it proceeds. Um,
That's fair.
That's a
yeah,
mess.
yeah. It's funny. I did make a map once of I did a paper, one paper on the US on biodiversity patterns and priorities. The funny thing is I didn't do that when I lived in the US. I did that after I moved to Brazil. Um, Maybe I felt like I was safer there if I said something people didn't like. Um, but you know, people have gotten in touch, and I think private sort of conservation decisions got informed by that. It helps support groups that are already working in some important places. Because then they can go in and say, look, we've been working here. Now, look, this other group of people say that where we're working is like the highest priority for this whole region. So can you help us protect this area or expand this park? So it's sort of a supporting role of people who are already interested in doing good work locally.
Well, I just I think I left this with so many more questions for you. Well, okay, well, we'll do one more because Obi asked one before we head out. If that's all right, do you have time, Clinton?
Sure, sure.
Okay, great. So, thank you so much. Are there any specific regions lacking coverage in biodiversity mapping that you want to highlight?
Um, well, yeah, I would say every place can get covered in a map. The quality of that map varies a lot. And that's because if you look where people have collected data or are going to look for things, it varies dramatically, orders of magnitude. So some places are too dangerous to go or don't have the resources. People just haven't gone very much. Um, but an interesting thing is that can actually be quantified as well. And so I was in a group of people that wanted to map ant biodiversity. This is the result of drinking beers in Raleigh, North Carolina with some people. And they're like, hey, do you want to work with us on doing this? And it's like, okay, let's go map all the world's ants. Well,
Ants?
one actually we could map all of them. We could map, I think, about 17,000 out of the 30,000 or so estimated species. Right? There's a pretty good chunk. Um,
No,
One of the interesting things that came out of that, though, was sort of the inverse, because you can say, well, where are the areas that we would expect there to be more species based on some environmental parameters and how much people have looked, but we don't find them. So they made like what they call a treasure map. Like, well, these are the places where species are missing. So these are the places you should go if you want to name a new ant species, because that's probably where they're at. Because we know there should be more there based on what we know about all everywhere else, but nobody's gone there to collect and see what's there. So you can do that for other groups too. Um,
are,
Erin, I
are,
mean, sorry,
are,
go ahead, Sichi.
are we talking about ants?
Yes,
Ants,
ANTS, ants.
ANTS.
How can there be 17,000 species?
No, there's estimated like 30 or 40,000, but we could map 17,000. There's a
Oh,
lot of kinds of ants. It's amazing. And the ants are way more diverse than other things. And the
I saw
way they live. and the habitats is mind-boggling. I mean, it's just I read a book about him. I forget the name of the author. I met him
Yogos.
briefly once, and it was just unbelievable, like all the ways that ants survive. Because they're way older than us. So like ants have, evolved like 60, 70 million years ago and diversified.
Yeah.
So you get ants that live inside of like plants. You have things that they like build their entire colony inside of an acorn. And you'll never see these things, but they're there.
I think the main theme here is there's so much that is left unexplored, and maps kind of, to tie it all together, maps kind of allow people to understand the importance of these areas in terms of undiscovered species and where they are, and why we should go and explore these areas, and specifically the places that saving nature is, where it's some of the highest rates of biodiversity and endemic life in the world.
Yeah.
Clinton, thanks so much for talking to us tonight.
Thanks,
Andy, thanks
thanks
so
for
much
having
for
me.
organizing this. It's always been it's great fun and everybody. I mean, first of all, please visit Saving Nature and look at what we do. But Clinton has the biodiversitymapping.org site, which is just fantastically interesting in terms of telling us about where where biodiversity is in the world. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Clan.
Let's see, there's the link. Let's see if it
There's
works.
the link.
There we go.
Perfect.
If anybody
Biodiversitymapping.org.
has ideas, let me know.
Well, thank you so much. This is going to be recorded and sent out shortly via email on a newsletter and social medias. Thank you
Right.
so much, everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your night. Happy Wednesday.
Take care. Bye bye.
Night, everyone.
Thank you, Clinton.